very happy to introduce Roger Spitz. Roger Spitz is a leading authority on systemic disruption and strategic foresight. Before founding the influential Disruptive Futures Institute in San Francisco, he served as a global head of technology M&A at BNP Paribas, advising on over $25 billion in transactions. Spitz is an expert advisor to the World Economic Forum's Global Foresight Network. As president of Techistential, a preeminent foresight practice, Spitz advises CEOs, boards, and investors on strategy under uncertainty, anticipating disruptions and sustainable value creations. A renowned expert on AI, Spitz coined the term techistentialism and is sought after thought leader on the future of strategic decision-making and artificial intelligence. He serves on multiple boards and is a best-selling author of 5 books, including the award-winning Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World, and acclaimed 4-volume series in the Definite Guide to Thriving on Disruptions. Roger Spitz frameworks are adopted globally and feature in leading publications. His recent paper challenges the legacy risk models, the future of risk and insurability in an era of systemic disruption, unpredictability, and artificial intelligence in the Journal of Operational Risk. I'm very happy that you are able to be here with us, Roger. I would say, please go ahead with your presentation, the unpredictability and adaptive risk management for our deeply uncertain world. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ron and CERA Vision, for having me. So on that note, I think today we're in an age where data is worshipped as the oracle for decision-making. So we want to dive in a little bit around that and what it means in particular for risk management. Now, I started my career as a chartered accountant in London. I was then, as Ron mentioned, global head of M&A. And in that world, data is king. You use it for synergies calculation, for market price expectations. Data is absolutely king. And I can tell you that today in San Francisco, living in Silicon Valley, the obsession is even worse than that. Now, every day, many decision makers choose to ignore numbers. The markets can decide to ignore $37 trillion of debt on the US side, as an example, but ultimately they'll ignore it until they can't. But what if it is not just a question of choosing what we ignore or not ignore, but what if we weren't able to actually quantify what we decided to? What if rare is becoming less rare, extreme is becoming more frequent, and we actually need to reframe what normal is? When you look at the World Uncertainty Index, you can see that it rises quite significantly, and the frequency of it rises over time. Now, as a futurist, effectively a foresight practitioner, you might say that it's part of our tropes to sort of say we're constantly at the peak of uncertainty. But we believe that it's structural. We believe that we're entering an era where we need to understand uncertainty better and maybe reframe how we manage our what are currently often predict and act models. When you look at the IMF, amongst others, for them, they're looking at areas where there's an exceedingly deep uncertainty, where unpredictability enters the stage as an entire era. When you look at JP Morgan, which is often quite shrewd in terms of how it thinks about the world, they're referring to tectonic shifts, setting up different departments which are trying to be less siloed around geopolitics and other considerations to help understand the ramifications of this. When you look at a lot of yourselves or your colleagues on the different screens in the markets, they'll be particularly interested in what some call the fear index, which is effectively the VIX index, looking at uncertainty, which again is seeing those peaks. And then, of course, important topic of the day around climate, where you're looking at not only systemic, but potentially irreversible impacts. Now, when you look at all of these in isolation, they are all of significant events. But what if not only are they significant, but they interact a lot, and the frequency is turning them from exceptional to business as usual? And this is where we want to spend a moment. When you look, for instance, at NOAA and the monitoring they're doing, you notice that until relatively recently, you had one or two in the US, for instance, more than 1 billion severe weather events per year, that this is becoming closer to 25% on average, 25, sorry, of such events. So that's kind of 2 a month. So you're moving to a different level of frequency, which seems to be recurring. And one key word for me, which is really a key word for 2025, and we saw it at featuring very heavily at the Munich Security Conference, but even more generally, is multipolar. And what does multipolar have to do with unpredictability? What is multipolar? Why is it important? Now, multipolar is really a contrast to the state of the world where maybe you had the US and Western-led order, which was a multilateral world, where there was some alignment to reach mitigations for some of our complex challenges. Now, it's normal that the world moves away from a Western and certainly a US-centric world order, if you can call it that. That is normal. There are different parts of the world that are rising in influence and significance. And the role and the size of the population and GDP of the G7 is actually reducing over time. So we appreciate the need to shift what we define as the world's influences and world order. But what if these worldviews were structurally irreconcilable? What if, by design, there was no intention of reaching any alignment? What if you're not clear on what rules prevail, who's applying those rules, and what rules are being established? Here, what happens is that you can't mitigate, you can't align, you can't necessarily reach solutions for some of our world's most complex challenges. And in this world, multipolar basically means that the 80 years or so of rule-based worlds not only have different rules, but have rules which are sort of unclear, and then state, non-state, and decentralized networks, which are leading in this world in dynamics which are unpredictable. And it's that which enhances significantly the degree of unpredictability which one needs to integrate, which goes beyond just geopolitics. It includes geoeconomics, geotechnology, and one could argue almost ideology. So in this context, we have to ask ourselves, what is the risk of relying on business as usual? Because you have an inverse relationship between uncertainty and knowability. So the less uncertainty, the easier it is to predict. Now, given that we are in deep times of uncertainty, effectively there's a rising cost of assuming a stable, predictable, linear, and controllable world. You've seen it when Germany has relied on the one little assumption that the closer they are to Russia, the greater military dependency, the greatest security, the greatest energy security and food security they had. That little assumption cost a lot for countries. When NATO relied on the little assumption of the peace dividend and didn't perceive any wars or threats, and basically predicated again their military spending, their strategies around that little assumption. When the Feds and the central banks relied on a world of low inflation, and suddenly you wake up and you have the highest inflation in half a century, and then suddenly you'll have Yellen and others sort of say, well, sorry, we thought we could control it, but we couldn't. Or when Jaguar Land Rover maybe wasn't clear enough, fast enough in terms of its insurance for cyber, and basically its hack in August has costed, it probably running into tens of billions of dollars once you take everything into account, with factories stopping for weeks, if not months. These can be existential for an entire industry or company. So these little assumptions, instead of having maybe the 2008 financial crisis, the 2000 tech crisis, and then you go back to normal, what if they were more systemic? What if they were more extreme frequently as business as usual? And the costs of assuming that you might have these exceptions, that you can look at the risk of these exceptions and then move on to business as usual, maybe those costs are rising. And this is where we need to spend a minute or two. And why is that? What is linked to this unpredictability? What are the implications? There's an important distinction which we may know but not fully integrate or may not necessarily be aware of. So I want to spend a minute or two with a distinction between what's complicated and complex. And we'll see the implications for risk frameworks, and in particular the decide, decision, and then act frameworks. In a complicated world, you understand cause and effect ex ante. It's linear. There's a range of right answers. You can rely on expertise and experts for those. What we call known unknowns. And effectively, it's linear and incremental. So, how do you send a probe to Mars? I can't do it. It's pretty hard, but science understands how you send a probe to Mars. Why is drug discovery very good today with AI platforms? Because we have certain understanding of how the body works, the NDA, the DNA, etc. And this AI is very strong because you can recognize patterns at scale. You can run 1,000 simulations. It's basically linear and it's predictable. And here you sense, you analyze, you respond, playbooks work, frameworks work, models work. Now in complex, you don't necessarily know ex ante what the cause and effect is of a particular course of action. They are unknown unknowns. There may be no right answer or no expert that can help at that particular juncture. It's nonlinear and exponential. It's emergent. So it's trial and error. It's a discovery process. And so there you need enablers, and you need to basically probe, sense, and respond and see what happens as a result of that. And that is a different environment. It's, if you take the Amazon forest and you want to build a hotel or move a road, the dynamic multiple drivers that are influencing things. And these are constantly changing. They're constantly interacting. They are not predictable or linear. And you simply don't know necessarily ex ante what the implications are. So any model that's predicated on a predict and act and predictability is likely to get it wrong because it's emergent and evolving. And I think this comes back to a need maybe to do a slight extension to a distinction we've known for 100 years, thanks to Maynard Keynes and to Frank Knight, between risk and uncertainty. With risk and uncertainty, we understand, reasonably the distributions. Risk, better than I do, given the audience. The parameters, you can probabilize them. If you drive at a certain speed, the risk of a particular accident, if you smoke X cigarettes per day, etc. And these are relatively well understood. Now, with uncertainty, you might know the future states. You have a question that you're asking. You may not necessarily know how to probabilize it, but effectively, you have some understanding around what these outcomes might be. Who will be elected president? What will be will the UK economy be in a recession in 5 years' time? These kind of questions have an answer to them. We understand the different parameters. And this is where there's sort of some of the predictive models and new predictive markets are thriving. Now, deep uncertainty, or what Mervyn King calls radical uncertainty, here we need to think a little bit differently, because in deep uncertainty, you basically don't know what the possible outcomes are, what the possible future states are. There are too many, and there are a multitude of them. You don't necessarily know how to probabilize them. You don't even know what these future states are. You don't necessarily know how to mitigate them or how to address them. And the experts themselves may not necessarily come to an agreement as to what the mitigations might be for these future states. You can't put a priority or hierarchy to them. There's no necessarily agreement on whether they exist or not, let alone how you might prioritize them. And most importantly, you're not necessarily taking into account how they might interact, but they're all constantly interacting. And this is deep uncertainty. So you're looking at, What does longevity look like? Will you live till 90, 100, 150, or 200? You're looking at whether artificial superficial intelligence or singularity might arise, and when. What are the implications? You're looking at the next second or third order level implications of change, such as climate. Of course, we have climate change, although not everybody agrees on that as a future state. But what exactly does it look like? Which cities might be underwater? When? How does that affect mass migration? How does that interconnect then to other things? Will you work and live in space, etc., etc.? Plus all the different future states you might be thinking about for normal uncertainty. When you're looking at the state of deep uncertainty, you're moving way beyond what is predictable, and you're in this complex environment of emergent, nonlinear, unpredictable. And nonlinear is a very important feature because it means that small outcome inputs can have very significant disproportionate outcomes. And risk, 1% risk in an asymmetric nonlinear environment doesn't mean anything if it can be existential. And nonlinear can be both positive and negative. So while I continue thinking about this, I want you also to spend a second. There's going to be a poll that's going to be given to you all. Feel free to answer. It's interesting if you do. We'll reveal in a few minutes as we wrap up the outcome of that. Ron will help us. And the question is really for you to give your view as to, in these three different states of least risk or most deeply uncertain and unpredictable, where you feel we currently stand. And so this is really a fundamental change to disruption. It's systemic, it's interacting, it's nonlinear, it's interacting in ways that are not predictable, it's interacting in ways where you need to look at the second and third order implications because things are cascading into everything else. And that's why the Fed got it wrong. They have the best supercomputers in the world, the central banks, they ran the inflation, and they're right to run the models and to use the best econometricians and supercomputers in the world. They're right to do all that. The danger is when you rely on the outcome of these models to the exclusion of everything else. And this is where we need to think about change in a different way. We actually call this meta-ruptions. We combine the word meta as you would for meta trends or mega trends and have meta plus disruptions. And we contrast this to the idea of trends or meta trends. Trends, they're predictable. You can rely on assumptions. You have data that you can analyze. You're looking at the first order implications. You can extrapolate it. And that's effectively, to a degree, what modeling does, with some sensitivities. But it's effectively what a lot of frameworks and models do. Now, the danger with trends is that, first of all, it's the rearview mirror. Second of all, you're relying on a linear and predictable world that allows you to extrapolate. Thirdly, you're not looking at how these individual meta trends or trends interact. You're assuming that they interact in a reliable, predictable, isolated manner. And by the time you're doing all that, effectively, you're running the danger of thinking about an isolated, predictable world, which simply doesn't exist. And so meta-ruptions is a provocation away from that, where you're thinking about novelty, surprises, discontinuity, and imagination, and new environments, and how they cascade. So this is really the difference between prediction and foresight. In predictions, you have a right answer, you know the parameters, there's a specific question you're asking yourself. And that's really where models work. Now, when rare is becoming less rare, extreme is becoming business as usual. We have to ask ourselves whether that's still valid, and that's where foresight comes in. Foresight and futures or futurists, you're not actually, believe it or not, trying to predict the future. Anybody who tells you they can predict the future, run a million miles. You're really thinking that actually you cannot predict because there are too many dynamic uncertainties. There are multiple unknowns and the interactions are complex. They're a broad set of possibilities with no right answers. And therefore, you need to think more broadly, not to predict and to have scenarios which you hope will arise, but to really help you think about the fact that the future is open and unwritten. And this is really where you look at certainty as something which is really only when you look at the rearview mirror. You're looking at the idea of wildcards, black swans, systemic disruption, systemic change, and that is really where your horizon should be, which is a difference between horizon scanning, which is dynamic and evolving, versus environmental scanning, which you're taking at a specific point in time. And even the whole idea of black swans and wild cards is often misunderstood. They both relate to low probability, high impact events, But effectively, black swans, you really cannot predict in the Taleb language. Nassim Taleb from Black Swans and his Incerto 5-volume collection. These are outliers that are really absolutely unpredictable. When boards tell you it was a black swan and they decided to ignore signals, they decided not to take certain preparations, etc., these are most likely not black swans, because if you notice something you could have noticed, then it's maybe a wild card. Wild cards actually happen quite often. They're perceived as unlikely, but could be spotted and therefore prepared for. So when you look at uncertainty, we find it very helpful at the Disruptive Future Institute to look at what we call the complex five. I'm originally from South Africa, and we have the big five in game. These are the biggest, dangerous, most scary animals, right? Although they're phenomenally beautiful and endearing. And it's your buffalo, it's your rhino, it's the elephant, and a few others. But really, in the systemic change world, you need to think about the complex five as a degree of uncertainties. The butterfly effect affects everything. It's how everything cascades. It's why we use the term meta-eruptions. Things interact and cascade into things that are unpredictable. Simple as that. And then you have the two ends of the spectrum. The known from Michelle Walker's wonderful book, The Grey Rhino. You know it. It's charging at you. It's COVID in March 2020. It's too late. You better do something about it because it's too late. The elephant in the room is known unknowns. It's standing there. You choose to ignore it. It might be changing education to be adapted for AI. It might be a number of things. But effectively, the thing about the black elephant is that you choose to ignore it, it will turn into a grey rhino and charge at you. The most dangerous, I think, is actually the black jellyfish. With climate change, the acidity and the temperature of the water caused increasing jellyfish. And the first order implications was that suddenly there were more jellyfish in the world. But what the world didn't realize is that the second and third order implications were that suddenly ships were starting to fail and nuclear plants were starting to fail. And so you need to look at what could cascade, what could be the next order implications. And then you have the black swans, which are the only things that are really absolutely unpredictable. But you can build resiliency for these things. You can ask for black jellyfish, what if? What if this phenomenon continues? What is the second or third order implications? So there are things you can do with the different degrees of uncertainty. And what it means thinking more adaptively and dynamically than maybe the predict and act models. We call this the AAA. You need agility to reconcile different time horizons. You need to be anticipatory, to think about the future possible scenarios, not to rely on them, but on the contrary, to appreciate that there's a diversity of things that might arise. And you need anti-fragile foundations, which we'll come to in a second. Anticipatory is actually quite simple. It's what we do in foresight and futures. It's just really asking the what if questions. Most of the time, what people are called short by boards, central banks, whatever, it's not necessarily the most complicated model in the world. You can't probabilize or modelize out risk. You can't predict what is unpredictable. There's no data on the future. But asking the what if question is very helpful, I can tell you, more than the 20 additional lines of code. And then you have anti-fragility, which again from Nassim Taleb. Fragile, it breaks. It's not resilient. Resiliency is fine. You can knock it and it improves. You can knock it and it doesn't get destroyed. It's like an elastic or rubber band. But anti-fragility actually improves with shocks. So you need to find ways whereby you can improve impacts with shocks. It's the difference between Viasat satellites, which break as a single point of failure, like when Ukraine was invaded by Russia. The satellites were deactivated immediately. And then you had Elon Musk's Starlinks, which are decentralized, low Earth orbit, which are anti-fragile. 3 years later, they still haven't managed to break them down because there are no single points of failure. So anti-fragility is a very important concept. And the agility is really to recognize that you need to bridge the long-term with short-term decision-making. You need to constantly have feedback loops that allow you to bring that in. And there are various examples of this which one can find, including in climate. So it's like a feedback loop. You need foundations which are anti-fragile. You need to be agile to reconcile the longer term and the shorter term, but only the present exists in the here and now. So you need cognitive, emergent, and strategic agility to emerge in the here and now in the complex decision making of trial and error, because you can't just follow playbooks, you can't just predict different outcomes. So our AAA framework is really building on these three concepts of the right foundations, of anticipatory thinking, and the agility for the here and now. We unpack this in quite a lot of detail in a paper which we have shared some details of, which we wrote in the Journal of Operational Risk, which Ron mentioned. I wrote it with the head of AXA, Olivier Desbier, in Foresight, and also we unpack it quite a lot in our book. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you, Roger. I have for you a number of questions, because don't think we let you go home now directly. You recently published that paper in RiskNet, but before going, let's see beyond the model. To which extent do you think environment is characterized by deep or radical uncertainty, was the question. Now, let's see. Could you comment on this first before going deeper in questions?
No, that's great. I mean, first, I think it's a good result. It shows that there's a reasonable awareness of the audience in terms of the environment we're in. I guess the next question, which we didn't have and which is part of this, is what do we do about it? Are our models building in these more extreme, these more rare, this deep uncertainty and unpredictability as rare and exceptional events, and we're kind of aware of it, and then we address climate and a few others? Or do we actually think that maybe we need to rethink our entire risk pricing, modeling, and frameworks more generally? For the anecdote, we sometimes do this exercise with a questionnaire at the very beginning and at the end. And what we find is that as the talk moves, more people feel that we are in a context of very deep uncertainty, and then there's a kind of shift. But I think that it's a pretty good, savvy audience you have, which is not surprising. But really the question is, what do we do now with it? And does it have implications in terms of our day-to-day work and that? And I'm not an insurer or actuary, so I'll let you carry on with that.
Yeah, but it's a bit related to the question I have, because you recently published in that paper of RiskNet, The Future of Risk, Insurability, long title. But why do you believe that this paper was necessary? And what were your objectives in writing it?
Yeah, there are a few things. I think, first of all, by spending a bit of time in the insurance market and with a lot of colleagues giving talks, and I got the feeling that distinction between uncertainty and deep uncertainty is either not fully integrated by the fields, and again, forgive me if I'm incorrect, or if it is, it's dealt with by exception, climate, etc., as opposed to really thinking with our day-to-day modeling tools and frameworks and pricing, etc., are integrating it. And if you can't insure, and if you're using tools that don't work, that has fundamental ramifications. The second element, which I think is pretty key as well, is that the frequency, the things you need to do about it are basically, at best, we're dealing with ex ante or preventative, like for health, or one or two elements. And this whole idea of resiliency is still dealt with the sort of models and the old assumptions of, what's a resilient balance sheet, etc. It's still not resilient in the real resiliency sense, in the systemic sense. And so I kind of feel that it's really maybe time for rethink as to fundamentally changing to more adaptive models along AAA or those concepts. But of course, I'm not in the field, so I'm just going by the reactions I've had, which so far have reinforced the relevance of these topics and the need to maybe rethink the tools.
Okay. Regarding your book, Disrupt with Impact, it was, I think, a year ago that it was released. I know that writing a book, it is a process which has some time. If you should have write it now, what changes should then be more or less, and how could that affect also insurance markets?
Yeah. So it's interesting. The key focus on the book is the themes we've talked about: unpredictability, and what sense-making and decision-making tools do you have for unpredictability? How do you think about things systemically? So if anything, since then, all the themes and that are still equally valid, if not more. I think the things that I would kind of emphasize even more is the speed with which certain things have developed, which I've put on the horizon, which are no longer cherry on the cake or best practice, but actually urgent. When you're filming the fire of your house from your iPhone, instead of just talking about it, climate change is accelerating. When you're seeing the speed with which the dismantling of the world order and the end of multi-pluralism to a degree and the replacement of multipolar and the implications of that, this has very significant ramifications on rare events, extreme events, how frequent they are, and what it means to operate in a deeply unpredictable world. So I would say fundamentally, I think it moves from kind of moving to almost an emergency for the field of insurance and the whole world, markets and market constituents, to more kind of an emergency manual and then kind of thinking about things on the horizon. So I think it's a time frame which collapses, where the future is impinging on the present.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have the feeling we could discuss this much longer over time, but in the time frame of this CERA Vision Congress, we don't have the possibility, but maybe there are possibilities that we can do it with a different occasion. I would love to go more in depth. Thank you very much.